Hello, grade 3 Pumpkooly students. You may not recognize Mrs. Weens today, but today I have my hair done in a way that most Egyptian women would wear their hair. A lot of Egyptian women and even men really valued young looking hair. Remember we talked about yesterday in the artist's pictures, they didn't want anyone looking old or looking imperfect. And so their hair was a way that they could maintain their youth, a way that they could continue to look young. And so a lot of Egyptian women would color their hair. And they didn't color their hair like maybe someone colors their hair. Because we didn't have hair color. They didn't have it back then. So they made their own. And they used juniper berries, which were local to the trees that they had where they lived. And juniper berries were a very dark, almost a purpley black color. And they would take those and they would smush them, and they would make a paste out of it. And they would take that paste and they would rub it on their hair. And they'd leave it on their hair for a while, and it would turn their hair. So if they had any white hair, because older people have white hair, or any other color, it would turn it black. And so I have black hair today because I'm an Egyptian lady, and I want you to remember that. I'll be continuing our story, Who Was King Tut, and I will read chapter 3 and 4 today. So this chapter title is called The Boy King. Still growing up in ancient Egypt was full of pleasures, especially if somebody belonged to the royal family. Tut was born a prince. He spent his childhood in a brand new place in Amarna. Egyptian palaces were huge. All over the palace grounds were beautiful gardens and giant pools, the size of lakes. Can you imagine having indoor pools in your house? Palace buildings were made of brick and covered in white plaster. The walls were covered with colorful paintings. There were separate buildings for the pharaoh and for the pharaoh's wife. Servants would have seen to all of Tut's needs. Each day they brought his food. Peasants ate bread and drank beer, but for a royal prince, they were meat and vegetables. Figs and dates. Wine was made from grapes grown in the north of Egypt, or from dates or figs or pomegranates. It appears that young King Tut was a member of the Clean Plate Club. A small statue of him reveals a chubby child with plump belly and arms. So he ate very, very well. His servants also bathed and dressed him. They shaved his head, leaving only one braid of hair at the side. So it's kind of silly to picture, but they would shave all of his hair, and then they would leave a little bit here that he could braid, and he'd wear it like that. This was the specific hairstyle for a prince. While he slept, they fanned him with plum fans. Then the heat would not disturb him, so they didn't have air conditioning. And remember, we said Egypt was was it like a desert? So it would have been very hot for him. So while he slept, people stood by his bed fanning him. Crocodiles lived in the Nile River, so guards kept watch every time Tut went swimming. Once he got older, he would ride his own chariot, drawn by 2 fine horses. Or he could sit back and enjoy a boat trip on the Nile. Tut took his bow and arrow and went hunting with his hounds. In the desert, he might shoot an ostrich. Pretty cool, they have ostriches there. Near the river where the ducks would hunt. Evidently, Tut liked playing a popular board game called Senet. He made sure 4 sets were put in his tomb. We'll talk about that later. Did he like to play music? Perhaps so. Trumpets were found in his tomb as well. If he didn't want to play himself, musicians would play for him. They would play the harp and lute and pipe. Because of the heat, even princes and princesses wore light, simple clothing. Paintings of Tutankhamun showed him in a pleated kilt of white linen. So here's a picture of what we think he looked like. So men and princes would wear this pleated kilt, so it's like a skirt. And it would be a very thin fabric, so it wouldn't be hot for him. His clothes were simple, but his jewelry was not. So for ancient Egypt, The men also wore lots of jewelry. He wore heavy gold bracelets and rings. Some necklaces of beads and gold were large, and they covered his chest. His wife wore lots of beautiful, heavy jewelry as well. So did other royal children. Young boys wore very heavy earrings. Ancient Egypt was the first place to develop a written language. So remember we talked about ancient civilization being very smart and intelligent? Well, it's here where people learned how to write, how to communicate using writing. Boys learned to read and write starting at 4 years old. Did King Tut know how? Probably. Writing materials were put inside his tomb. A beautiful brush case belonging to Tut was made from wood covered in gold foil with gemstones. If Tut didn't feel like doing his own writing, he could have a scribe do it for him. So a scribe is a kind of someone who works for you who does all the writing. Oh, here it talks about that. A scribe's job was to write down all the pharaoh's orders and letters for him. The Egyptians didn't have pens or pencils. Instead, they took a reed and they chewed, so a reed just grows in nature. They chewed the end of it off. When the tip was split apart, it could be used as a brush. Black ink was made from the soot or charcoal. It came in small, round blocks. A student had to dip his brush in the water pot before rubbing it in the ink. Egyptians made a kind of heavy paper from papyrus plants along the banks of the Nile. So if you're interested, one of the projects I wanted to do in class with you was to make papyrus paper. But since we're not together, it's not something that we can do together. If you are interested, you can look it up online on how to do that, and it's very simple. You can make that at home if you'd like with your parents. The stem of the plant was cut into long strips. The strips were then placed into 2 layers, crosswise, and pounded with a hammer. When all the juice was pounded out, the 2 layers formed a single sheet of paper. That was put under a heavy stone until it dried out even more and became flatter. The last step was to rub the papyrus sheet back and forth with the stone until it was smooth. Instead of binding sheets of papyrus into books, the sheets were rolled up into scrolls. Papyrus paper was very strong. Some scrolls had been found thousands of years later, so that paper lasted that long. They were still in good shape. Papyrus was also easy to erase. A dab of water was all that was needed to get rid of a mistake. So remember, they're writing with charcoal, so they don't have erasers. They can't erase it. As a child, Tut probably made lots of mistakes learning to write. Our alphabet that we know, only has 26 letters. His had about 1,000 different symbols called hieroglyphs. Many hieroglyphs look more like pictures than letters. So in your workbook that you have home, that Mrs. Gavigan and I sent home with you, there are hieroglyphs. And there's an assignment that we'd like you to do in there using hieroglyphs. After the ancient empire of Egypt came to an end, the meaning of hieroglyphs was lost for many centuries. No one could translate the writing. It was like a secret code that no one could break. Then in 1822, a Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion finally figured out how to decipher, so how to make sense of these hieroglyphs. Many of the objects of King Tut's tomb were inscribed with the pharaoh's name in hieroglyphs. So the King Tut's name looks like that. That's how he would write it. So not something that we could read. So I want to make sure that you look at your work package that we sent home and that you practice some of those hieroglyphs. Maybe you can learn how to write your own name in that, or write a secret message and try to get your mom or your dad or your brother or your sister to break the code. Chapter 4, An Early Death. During Amenhotep's 16-year-long rule, so that's King Tut's father, the empire did not run smoothly. The lands under Egypt control had to pay tribute. This meant that every year they had to send riches to the pharaoh. For instance, from Nubia, in the south came gold. Lebanon had to send rare cedar wood, but the Egyptian army had grown very weak. Tribute had stopped coming in. Then Amenhotep was gone. King Tut was just a child. Do you remember how old he was when he became king? How could he be expected to make the empire strong? People think he was about 9 or 10 when he became king. The real power now lay with Tut, or his chief minister, and one of the army generals. Tut was the ruler in name only. He appeared in important ceremonies and holidays. If Tut had lived beyond his teen years, perhaps he would have grown up to be a strong, wise ruler. Or maybe he always would have been under the thumb of his advisors. So that just means even though he was the title, he was the king or the pharaoh of Egypt, he was too young to make the real hard decisions. And so his advisors, so these older men, would help him and they would make the decisions. Perhaps they were afraid if Tut had more power, he might try to bring back the strange ways of his father. Instead, older temples were reopened, and Thebes, not Amarna, came to the royal city once again. Tut moved back there with his queen. They may have had children. In Tut's tomb, along with his coffin, 2 tiny coffins were also found. They contained the bodies of 2 baby girls. So it's possible that they were Tut's children, but we're not 100% certain. What we do know is this. He didn't leave a son behind to become pharaoh after he died. So remember that it's only the sons that become kings or pharaohs. And even in a time when most people did not live to the age of 40, Tut still died very young. He was only 18 or 19 when he died. It is not surprising that some historians have suspected foul play, which means they think someone may have done something to kill him. Perhaps the general or some of his advisors didn't like that he was this young ruler, and maybe they wanted him dead so that he wouldn't be the king anymore. In modern times, a popular notion was that Tut died from a blow to the head. But in 2005, CAT scans were done of the pharaoh's 3,000-year-old body. Over 2 months, cross-sectional images were taken from head to toe. So it says, think of Tut's body as a loaf of bread, with each image as a slice of bread. When all the images were assembled, they created a 3-dimensional picture of his body, inside and out. What did the scientists learn? Wonder what they found out. There appeared to be an injury to his head, but it did not happen while he was alive. Tut's skull may have been injured only after he died. So he was not killed because of that. However, the tests were not able to rule out all other methods of someone killing him. For example, there was no way to tell if Tut had been poisoned. Evidence of poison wouldn't show up on these scans. The scientists did find that Tut had a broken leg. It is possible that his injury may have caused an infection, and he died from his broken leg. The tests on Tut are now over. His body probably doesn't need to be examined anymore. The man who headed the testing said, "We should leave him in peace." Tut was placed in his coffin and returned to his burial chamber. So that is it for today. Every day I want to give you some interesting facts about ancient Egypt. So today was about my black hair and why a lot of Egyptians had black hair. I also want to give you a bit of a math challenge because you remember I taught you math last term and I loved it. I really enjoyed seeing you think and figure out strategies for finding out problems. So every day I think I'm going to give you a little bit of a challenge and I want you to figure out the challenge. So I'll get that ready.